We're very excited at Matan to have Dr. Sharon Galper Grossman here to speak to us today. Dr. Grossman is a radiation oncologist, former faculty member of Harvard Medical School, and a graduate of the Marot Halakha program at Matan Sharon. She lectures and writes about health and halakha, and we are interested to hear what you have to say today.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's truly an honor to be learning with you tonight, and it warms my heart to see so many friends, family members from far and wide, and of course, Rabbi Shapiro and Rabbanit Bina and Rabbanit Halpfinger, and my parents, not the least of which. So thank you for joining. I wanted to share with you a conversation that I had with my nephew recently. My nephew is a junior in college. And he called me up and said, Aunt Sharon, I'm thinking about participating in a human vaccine challenge trial for COVID-19. And he explained to me that he would join 100 other volunteers, and he would enter a designated medical facility with high level care that had an intensive care unit available. And half of the people who were with him would receive an experimental COVID-19 vaccine, and the other half would receive a placebo. They'd receive an injection with sugar water. They wouldn't know whether they got the vaccine or the placebo. And they'd sit and wait in the facility for a couple of weeks so that the people who got the vaccine would take effect. And then all of them, the ones who got the vaccine and ones who got the placebo, would be deliberately exposed to COVID-19. And then they would wait and see what happened. And if he became sick, he would have access to the best medical care. He'd have access to, for sure, he'd get a respirator if he needed. He would have treatments, whatever was available. And after a certain amount of time passed, when he was no longer considered to be infectious, he could leave. We wouldn't be able to visit him while he was in the facility, but we could call him. And I was speechless. I asked him, well, why? Why would you do this? And he said, well, for Bubby and Zadie, because Bubby and Zadie haven't seen their children in the last 8 months. And they haven't seen their new grandson, and they missed out on their new great-grandchildren. And I'm doing it to do my part to help the world to end COVID-19. That's why I would do it. And then he asked me, Aunt Sharon, do you think that this is ethical? Do you think that halacha would permit me to do this? And so for the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you my answer to him. My nephew's not alone. 37,000 individuals have come forward from over 100 countries to volunteer to participate in a COVID-19 vaccine trial, a human trial where they undergo deliberate exposure to COVID-19. And no trial yet is in place, but the World Health Organization endorses this kind of trial. Congressmen have appealed to the FDA to set up this kind of trial. And this past week, England announced that it will be opening up a trial just like this in January 2021. This is not a new study design. Actually, let me start by explaining the rationale behind this kind of trial. So a typical vaccine goes through 3 phases of development. Phase 1 involves 15 healthy subjects who are injected with the experimental virus, and we observe them to see if the vaccine is safe. Phase 2 involves about 30 subjects, also injected with the vaccine. And again, they're followed to determine if the vaccine is effective. And stage 3 is the biggest rate limiting step in vaccine approval. It involves several thousand individuals, half of whom are injected with the vaccine. The other half is injected with a placebo, which is just sugar water. And then they go home to wherever they live, and we wait to see how they do. We wait to see if they become infected, if they develop side effects. And the problem is that when they go back to where they live, they may live in areas where the risk of infection is quite low, and it could take years to determine if the vaccine is effective. And the beauty of a vaccine challenge trial is that, number one, it only involves about 100 subjects, not thousands, and we can get an answer about the vaccine fairly quickly over the course of weeks to months because we're deliberately exposing people to the virus. And this is very important for COVID-19 because it could potentially save thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives. It's estimated that every day that the pandemic continues, 1,000 people die in the United States. And for every 6 extra months that the virus continues, 500,000 people will die in the world. So accelerating vaccine approval could have a tremendous benefit in saving human lives. This is not a new approach, though. Vaccine challenge trials have a long history and date all the way back to 1796 when Edward Jenner discovered the smallpox vaccination. Jenner noticed that milkmaids had a very low risk of infection from smallpox, and he hypothesized that they were potentially exposed to cowpox, a similar but less aggressive form of the virus. And so he injected a healthy 8-year-old boy with cowpox and then exposed him to smallpox, and lo and behold, he did not become infected. Now, this trial would most certainly be considered unethical today, but it was the forerunner of vaccinology and virology and led to the end of the smallpox epidemic. And throughout history, human vaccine challenge trials have sometimes been riddled with unethical conduct, but most recently, they have adhered to a very high ethical standard and have helped to test vaccines against typhoid, cholera, and malaria. But those diseases have a treatment. They have effective cures. There is no cure for COVID-19, which makes the ethics of these trials all the more complicated. And so there are ethicists who argue that it is absolutely ethical to participate in a human COVID-19 vaccine trial because we're involving healthy subjects who have a very low risk of infection. And these are young people who would potentially be infected anyway, but they live in areas that don't have a lot of medical resources. And so now they're getting infected, but they're guaranteed the best possible medical care. They also argue that every day we expect individuals in society to take huge risks for altruistic purposes to save others. We expect firemen to run into burning buildings. We expect soldiers to go off and fight wars. We also permit people to engage in some very risky behaviors. We allow people to smoke, and people can ride motorcycles. People who argue that it's unethical, however, would say that my nephew can't really give informed consent because we don't even know the long-term side effects of COVID-19 infection. And it's possible that the vaccine could increase the severity of infection. Also, they argue that by accelerating vaccine approval, we might compromise academic rigor of these studies, which could lead to more distrust of vaccines and potentially open us up to a whole host of unethical clinical research. And so how does Halakha view my nephew's participation in a human COVID-19 vaccine challenge trial? Would Halakha permit him to participate? And so to answer this question, we need to explore how Halakha approaches risky medical treatment. And so we begin with a Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Daf Kaf Zayin Amud Bet. Gemara discusses when one may go to see a pagan doctor for treatment, under what circumstances. And the concern with the pagan doctor is that he might kill the Jew. And so the Gemara writes, Safek chai, safek meit, ein mitrapin mehen, vadai meit mitrapin mehen. If there's any possible chance that the Jew could be saved by the pagan doctor, he may not go to the pagan doctor. But if he will certainly die, then he may go to the pagan doctor. And the Gemara asks, Meit, Hayesha, if he's even though he's certainly going to die, Judaism has tremendous value, places tremendous value on human life. He's still alive. He hasn't died yet. Hayesha, he still has temporal life. How do we allow him to compromise his remaining time alive and go to this doctor who could kill him immediately? And the Gemara answers, L'chayesha lo chayshinan. We do not, we discount or we discount Hayesha. We discount the temporal life that remains for him. And the Gemara then asks, Umana temara de la Hayesha lo chayshinan. From where do we know that we discount Hayesha? We discount temporal life. And the Gemara answers, Dichtiv im amarnu navo ha'ir v'hara'av ba'ir umetnu sham. Gemara cites a story in Melachim Bet of 4 lepers who are exiled from their town, exiled from the camp, the Jewish camp, and they face a tremendous dilemma. They face famine. There is no food for them, and they have several options. They could go to the desert, but there's no food in the desert, so they'll starve in the desert. Or they could try to return to the Jewish camp, where again there is no food, there's a famine. Or they see a camp of Aramim off in the distance, and they say, maybe we'll go to the camp of the Aramim. Now they might kill us, but they also might save us. And so they go to the camp, and lo and behold, the camp is empty. The Aramim had heard a loud noise. They thought they were being attacked. They evacuated, and the camp is full of food, and the lepers eat, and they live. The Gemara asks, "V'ha'ika chayesha." What do you mean? How could the lepers go to the Aramean camp? They're not dead. They're still alive, and they're compromising the remaining time left to go to the Aramim, who might kill them immediately. How can they do that? And the Gemara answers, Ella lav l'chayesha lo chayshinan. No, we discount their temporal life, and they may go to the Aramean camp, even though they could be killed immediately. And so the Shulchan Aruch codifies this principle into law, allowing one to see a pagan doctor when one will most certainly die. Im hu vadai met mitrapim mimeno de l'chayei sha'a lo chayshinan. He may visit the pagan doctor because we discount the temporal life, the remaining limited time that the person who will most certainly die has left. So based on halacha permits a Hayesha to receive risky medical treatment. And so the question is, can we apply the principle of l'chayesha lo chayshinan to my nephew, who is a healthy college student, who is not sick, and does this principle permit him to undergo a risky medical treatment, receive an experimental vaccine, and then undergo deliberate infection with a lethal virus for which there is no cure? And to answer that question, we need to define several terms. We need to answer a few more questions. So number one, how do we define a Hayesha? Would a healthy volunteer qualify as a Hayesha? Number two, how much risk may a Hayesha incur? Number three, for what benefits may a Hayesha incur this risk? And let's assume that my nephew has no benefit from participating in the human vaccine challenge trial. Can he endanger himself purely for altruistic purposes to save others? Also, he would receive an experimental vaccine. How does halacha view experimental therapy? And finally, if he is permitted to participate in a COVID-19 vaccine trial, is he obligated to do so? Are we all obligated to do so? So let's start with the first question. Who qualifies as a Hayesha? Rishonim and Achronim do not offer a precise definition of Hayesha. The definition ranges from a life expectancy of 1 to 2 days to as long as 12 months, and perhaps even longer than 12 months. And the Chachmat Shlomo, Rav Shlomo Kluger, explains that we really need a precise definition of Hayesha, Because if we say Hayesha, someone who has a life expectancy of 1 year, or someone who has a life expectancy of 2 years, you could take this argument to its extreme and say that unless Mashiach comes, we are all Hayesha until 120. And so where do we draw the line? And so he points to the treifa, which is an animal or an individual who has experienced a mortal wound with a life expectancy of 12 months or less. But Rabbi Bleich from Yeshiva University says, you know, this 12-month rule, 12-month definition for Hayesha is counterintuitive, and it can't be that rigid. Because what do you do with the following scenario? A patient who has leukemia and is given 13 months to live. And the doctors offer him a dangerous medical treatment that could cure him, or it could kill him. And because he has 13 months to live, he does not have the halakhic status of Hayesha. And so he'd have to wait a month to undergo the treatment, and then he'd have a 12-month life expectancy, but his medical condition would deteriorate, and the chances of the treatment working would be even less. And so there has to be some fluidity to the definition of Hayesha beyond 12 months. But all of these opinions and definitions of Hayesha assume that the individual is already sick. He already has a terminal illness. The cause of death is already there. And at first glance, it would seem that my nephew, who was healthy, could not possibly qualify as Hayesha. However, Tiferet Yisrael, Rav Yisrael Lifshitz, who lived in the early 19th century, was asked whether a healthy individual could undergo smallpox vaccination. And he writes, מזה נראה לי היתר לעשות אינוקולציון של פקקן, אף שאחד מאלף מת על ידי האינוקולציון, על כל פנים, שאם יתהווה בו הפקקן הטבעיים, הסכנה קרובה יותר, ולכן רשאי להכניס את עצמו בסכנה רחוקה כדי להציל את עצמו מסכנה קרובה. So he permits a healthy individual to undergo smallpox vaccination, which has a 1 in 1,000 risk of death, because the risk of dying of smallpox is far greater than the risk of the vaccine. And he cites a proof. וראיה ברורה לדבריי, ממה שכתב רבנו בית יוסף, בתור חושן משפט, סוף סימן תכ"ו, בשם הירושלמי, דחייב אדם להכניס את עצמו בספק סכנה כדי להציל חברו מוודאי סכנה, והרי ברואה חברו טובע בנהר, אינו מוחלט ודאי שיטבע אם לא יצילו, וכי לא אפשר שינצל ממקום אחר, ואם להציל חברו יש חיוב להכניס את עצמו בספק סכנה, כל שכן שיהיה רשות בידו להציל את גוף עצמו על ידי הכנסו את עצמו לספק סכנה. So the proof that the Tiferet Yisrael brings is from the Beit Yosef, who cites the Yerushalmi, that an individual is obligated to place himself in a possible danger to save his friend from a certain danger. And the classic example is, I'm standing on the edge of the Kinneret and I see someone drowning. And the Yerushalmi, based on this understanding, would obligate me to put myself in a possible danger and jump into the water to save him from a certain danger of drowning. But Tiferet Yisrael points out that it's not certain that the person in the water will die, because it is possible that someone else could jump in and save him. And nevertheless, the Yerushalmi obligates the bystander to jump in and assume a possible risk to save his neighbor, to save the person in the water from a possible risk as well. And if one is obligated to accept a possible risk, to assume a possible risk to save someone else from a possible risk, then certainly an individual would be permitted to accept possible risk of smallpox vaccination to prevent the possible risk of future infection with smallpox. And this distinction between possible risk and certain risk is an important one, because Tiferet Yisrael is suggesting that one can vaccinate and assume the risks of vaccination, even though one is not yet infected with smallpox, even though one may never become infected with smallpox, and even though infection is only a statistical probability. And he suggests that halacha values disease prevention and equates it almost, perhaps even equates it entirely with treatment of active disease. And so it would seem that, according to Tiferet Yisrael, my nephew, who is a healthy individual, would be permitted to undergo a dangerous treatment. However, exactly how much danger may a Hayesha accept? How much risk can he incur? And so poskim cite a variety of opinions of how much risk the Hayesha may incur, from as low as from a maximum of 50% to perhaps greater than 50%. And Beit David addresses the question of a risk of death, a treatment that causes death in 999 out of 1,000 people who receive it. And he says this requires further analysis. However, these poskim address the situation where the individual is already sick. He is terminally ill. How much risk may a healthy individual accept? And so we've already heard the answer from Tiferet Yisrael. A healthy individual can receive a treatment that has a 1 in 1,000 risk of death, similar to the 1 in 1,000 risk from smallpox vaccination. And how does this risk compare to participating in a COVID-19 vaccine trial? Well, the risk of long-term complications to all 20 to 29-year-olds infected with COVID-19 is around 1.1%. The risk of death is estimated at 0.03%, so a 3 in 10,000 risk of death. Now, the risk to my nephew could either be higher or lower than the numbers I've just quoted to you. It may be lower because he's young and healthy, and the numbers I quoted you include everyone between 20 and 29, including those who are sick. Also, he is guaranteed outstanding cutting-edge treatment, the kitchen sink, whatever we have to treat COVID-19. And the statistics I quoted you include people who come from resource-poor areas who would not necessarily receive such good treatment. On the other hand, the statistics that I quoted could underestimate his true risk, because it's possible that the vaccine could increase the severity of infection, and we really don't know the long-term effects of COVID-19 infection. Regardless of whether this is an exact estimate, it's above or below his true level of risk, the risk of participation is certainly well below the 50% risk cited by the poskim presented here, and well below the 1 in 1,000 risk of Tiferet Yisrael. But for what benefits may the Hayesha incur such a risk? Only for long-term cure, Chaye Olam, or would he be permitted to incur these risks for prolongation of life in the absence of a cure? Or would even pain relief be a legitimate reason for the Hayesha to incur such risk? So the majority of poskim believe that a Hayesha may only incur risk for long-term cure, for Chaye Olam. However, the Ramban defines Chaye Olam as Chaye Tuva, and Rabbi Bleich explains Chaye Tuva as longer life, suggesting that Hayesha could incur these risks purely for prolongation of life in the absence of cure. The Tzitz Eliezer suggests that one can undergo risky medical treatment purely for pain management, because intolerable pain is a very, very difficult way to live. And so what are the benefits to my nephew of participating? Well, by participating, he could achieve long-term immunity to COVID-19, Chaye Olam, either through infection, which would confer long-term immunity, or the vaccine, which could confer long-term immunity. Alternatively, infection might only give him temporary immunity. We've heard stories about people who become infected again with COVID-19, or the vaccine might only give him temporary immunity, and it only might be seasonal immunity, in which case participation would only give him Chaye Tuva, a longer life as defined by Rabbi Bleich. It's also possible, though, that participation might guarantee him best medical treatment if he becomes infected, which is another form of Chaye Olam, long-term cure. And maybe the only benefit to him is he no longer has to deal with social distancing and he can go visit Bubby and Zadie again without having to distance. Or it may be that there is no personal benefit to him from participating, and the only reason for him to participate is for altruistic reasons, to save others, to try to hasten the end of the pandemic. And so that brings us to our next question. May one endanger oneself to save others? And the answer to this question you have already seen in the Tiferet Israel, who quotes the Beit Yosef, who cites the Yerushalmi, which writes, "Afilu lahachnis atzmo v'safek sakana chayav." Again, we're going back to the story of the bystander standing on the edge of the Kinneret, and he sees someone drowning. And according to the Yerushalmi, as cited by the Beit Yosef, the individual is chayav. He is obligated to go into the water and save that drowning person. Yet, interestingly, Rav Yosef Karo does not codify this position into law in the Shulchan Aruch. When he discusses Kol hayachol lahotzil v'lo heitzil, he writes Over alo tamod al dam reyacha. He doesn't say that whoever can save and does not save is obligated to save. He doesn't use chayav. He says no. Merely he has violated lo tamod al dam reyacha. He has violated the mitzvah, but he does not cite an obligation. And so the Sma, Rabbi Yoshua Fal-Katz, asks why does the Shulchan Aruch why does Rabbi Yosef Karo not codify this into law in the Shulchan Aruch? And he explains this is because the Rambam, Rif, Rosh, and Tor did not cite the Yerushalmi. They did not bring this down to halacha. And the Pirchei Tshuva explains why this may be the case, because the Yerushalmi goes against the Bavli. The Talmud Bavli, it rules chayecha kodmim. Your life takes precedence over the person who is drowning. And when we have a contradiction, a conflict between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, halacha follows the Bavli. The Pirchei Tshuva then cites the Radbaz, who in a number of places addresses the level of risk that an individual must incur to save someone else who's in danger. And so he was asked about the following scenario. A foreign government took a Jew hostage, threatened to kill him unless another Jew cut off a limb. And the assumption was that cutting off the limb would not endanger the life of the Jew who agreed to do this. And the question posed to the Radbaz was, is this permitted? May the Jew cut off his limb to save the Jew in captivity? And he writes, Hilchach eini ro'eh tam ledin zeh ela midat chasidut va'ashrei chalko mi sheyochal la'amod bezeh ve'im yesh safek sakanat nefashot harei zeh chasid shoter. He says, if there's no risk of life to the Jew who agrees to amputate his limb, then okay, he's permitted to do it. It would be a midat chasidut. It would be an act of piety. But if there is any danger to the life of the Jew, then he would be a chasid shoteh to do this. He would be a fool to do this. And on his commentary on the Rambam Hilchot Rotzeach of Shmurat HaNefesh, the Radbaz again addresses the Yerushalmi, Kol hayachol lahatzil v'lo hatzil, and he quotes the Yerushalmi and explains that when the Yerushalmi obligates the bystander to jump into the water, it's afilu sheyesh bot ksat safek sakana kagon ra'a oto tovea bayam o listim ba'im alav o chaya ra'a sheyesh b'chol ela safek sakana afilu hachi chayav lahatzil. The Yerushalmi obligates the bystander to jump into not just when there is no risk, not just when there's no risk to the bystander, but even when there's ksat safek sakana, even when there is a small possible danger to the bystander. And he goes on to say that מכל מקום, אם הספק נוטה על הוודאי, אינו חייב למסור עצמו להציל את חברו, ואפילו בספק מוכרע אינו חייב למסור נפשו. אבל אם הספק אינו מוכרע, אלא נוטה על ההצלה, והוא לא יסתכן ולא הציל, עבר עלו תלמוד על דם ריחה. He explains that if the danger to the rescuer is as great as the likelihood he will succeed, if the chances he will succeed are the same as the chances that he himself will die or that he will face danger, then no, he is not obligated to jump into the water. There is no obligation. However, if the chances of his saving, if the danger to him is less and the chances of his saving the person in the water without endangering himself are great, then it would be a great mitzvah to jump in the water, and not doing so would violate lo tamad al dam riacha. So how do we make seder of all these levels of risk described by the Radbaz? Well, Rav Asher Weiss defines 3 levels of risk in the Radbaz. On the highest level of risk, there's a huge danger to the rescuer, and in that situation, it would be forbidden for the rescuer to jump in. When the risks to the rescuer are a little bit less, and there's a good chance that he can save himself, he could save the person in the water without endangering himself, then it would be midat chasidut to save him. It is permitted to save him. And when the risks to the bystander are minimal, when it's ksat safek sakana, then the bystander is obligated to save the person in the water. And so Rav Ovadia Yosef takes these varying levels of risk as defined by the Radbaz to answer the question, may one donate a kidney to someone? Does halacha permit this? And he cites a long list of poskim who forbid an individual to incur danger to save others. And he cites the Radbaz, and he explains that the Radbaz quotes the Yerushalmi, and that one who faces a small danger would be obligated to save, but when the danger is great, it would be prohibited. And when would the poskim and Radbaz prohibit a healthy bystander from jumping in and rescuing? When the risk to the rescuer is 50%, then it would be asur. But he spoke to many doctors, and the doctors who he spoke to told him, "Ulam be'emet shnimsar lanu mipi rofim mumchim v'yarei shamayim shedargat hasikun b'hotza'at hakilya la'adam hatorin hi mu'etet ma'od, u'kitishim v'teisha achuzim mehatormim chozrim lebriutam hatkina, v'lefiza harei kol ma shehiskimu aposkim hanizkar la'ayel sha'asur lahachnis atzmo b'safek sakana zehu rak b'safek hashakol ma she'ein kein b'nidun shalanu sheb'vadai shemitzvah." So yes, when we're talking about a 50% risk of death to the kidney donor, would be completely asur. But the doctors that the Rav Ovadia spoke to said that the risk of death from kidney donation was 1%. And so it certainly would be a mitzvah to accept this ksat safek sakana and donate a kidney. And the Rav Ovadia's use of this example of kidney donation is very, very profound in this larger ethical discussion of participation in a COVID-19 vaccine trial, because ethicists who argue that participation is ethical cite the example of kidney donation. And they say that the risk of kidney donation is comparable to the risk of COVID-19 vaccine trial. And that participation is ethical, because just as donating a kidney is considered ethical, so too it would participation in a COVID-19 vaccine challenge trial. And so if a Rav Ovadia considers donating a kidney a mitzvah, certainly my nephew's participation in such a trial, which wouldn't save just one life, but thousands of lives, potentially an entire generation, and end a pandemic, would truly be an act of tremendous merit. However, central to all of our discussion here is the notion of receiving a medical treatment. Even though it's a risky medical treatment, it's a treatment of proven benefit. And the vaccine that my nephew would receive in this trial is actually experimental. And so the question is, how does halacha approach experimental therapy? May one receive experimental therapy? Now, the Sitz Eliezer permits experimental therapy only when physicians can guarantee that the individual will not face any risk. There will be no danger to him. And that's clearly not the case in a COVID-19 challenge trial. However, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach permits participation in clinical trials, and he uses the following analysis. He explains that a Beit Din drafts individuals to fight a milchemet mitzvah, a necessary war. And sometimes when wild animals would overrun a city, the Beit Din would enlist the citizens' help in a form of milchemet mitzvah to rid the city of these wild animals. And today, however, we do not have a Beit Din, and we don't generally have wild animals overrunning our cities. And he writes, he explains that if we're going to be honest about the situation, there are times today where one could consider a disease an attack comparable to an attack of wild animals. And under those circumstances, the Beit Din could enlist the help, could draft its citizens to fight in this battle against the invading infection, and participation in this battle would be considered hatzalat nefashot. We don't have a Beit Din today. Instead, we have doctors who are experts who can enlist our help in trials to fight diseases and to fight cures. And certainly, it would be permitted to participate in these studies. And then he goes on to say that participation is safek hatzalat nefashot. It's possibly life-saving. We've talked on other occasions about pikuach nefesh, and that for pikuach nefesh, there is a halachic requirement of a chol lefanenu, a sick person before us. And so the Noda B'Yehuda prohibited autopsies because there was no sick person before us. And so Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach explains that there's a major difference between the autopsies of the Noda B'Yehuda and experimental treatments that we have today, and that we can consider experimental treatments chol lefanenu because the disease that is lefanenu, it is before us, and the treatments for these diseases have been introduced to the world. They are also before us. So halacha would permit my nephew to undergo an experimental treatment. And so it would seem that there is halachic precedent for participating in a human vaccine challenge trial, both to achieve immunity, because the risks of the process the risks of the trial are comparable to the risks of Tiferet Yisrael, and for altruistic purposes to save humanity. But what do modern poskim have to say about this? So Rav Asher Weiss wrote a tshuva on human challenge trials for COVID-19. And he explained that when there is a vital communal need, we ask people to risk their lives for altruistic purposes to save society. That's why we allow firefighters to run into buildings. That's why we allow physicians to take care of patients with infectious disease, even though there's a risk to them, because there's a need for people to fill these roles. And so there is a huge societal need for people to obtain results from these studies. And he permits one to participate because someone like my nephew is young and healthy, and the risks to him of participation are extremely low. And there's tremendous utility to developing a vaccine, which can save tens of thousands of lives. In terms of the issue of whether or not participation would be considered pikuach nefesh, He addresses the concerns of the Noda B'Yehuda and the requirement of Cholo Fanenu to qualify as Pikuach Nefesh. And he explains that even if we don't consider the trials Pikuach Nefesh, they are still performing a tremendous mitzvah, since an effective vaccine may save an entire generation from disease and death. And this is sufficient to allow someone to accept a remote risk. Also, he says we can't compare these trials to the autopsies of the Noda B'Yehuda, which were only being done to glean information for the future so the doctors could learn for the future, know how to maybe treat a patient that they know more about medicine later on. But in our situation of the vaccines, verifying the efficacy of a vaccine would not be characterized as a benefit in the distant future, rather as a great mitzvah that is in fact halachically considered to be possibly life-saving. And he concludes by addressing the possibility that, that in this time of COVID-19 pandemic, we are engaged in a mechamet mitzvah, which is a term proposed by Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach to describe a fight against a disease. And he rejects this definition of Milchemet Mitzvah. He says we cannot call our current situation Milchemet Mitzvah because the halachic status of a Milchemet Mitzvah only applies to situations where we are fighting an enemy army, and not in a situation where we're fighting in invading animals or a disease that threatens us. And if we consider the situation, the COVID-19 pandemic, as a milchemet mitzvah, then we would all be obligated to enlist in a COVID-19 trial and participate. However, having read some of Rav Asher Weiss's other tshuvot during the COVID-19 pandemic, it seems to me that he would consider our situation ke'en milchemet mitzvah, analogous to milchemet mitzvah, and for which each of us would be required to do our utmost to help halt the pandemic by socially distancing, wearing masks, and using hygiene and avoiding crowds and trying as much as possible to interact with others outdoors. And so he writes, in summary, I think one may volunteer for a human challenge vaccine trial. And so I tell my nephew that I am so proud of him for even considering participating, that if he decides to participate, we will support him. We will daven for his refuah shlema. That the poskim that I had mentioned, including most likely the Radbaz, would permit him to participate in such a trial, to achieve personal immunity, because the risks of participation are so low, on the order of those cited by the Tiferet Israel, and also to save humanity, the ultimate act of altruism to end the pandemic and limit this immeasurable loss of human life, and the economic devastation and hardship of the pandemic, and all the psychological distress that it has caused. So I thank you for listening. I am happy to answer questions. I wish you good health, and maybe be zoche to the discovery of a speedy, safe, and effective vaccine. Questions?
Amen. Yeshua.
Okay, thank you.
So much, Sharon. This was a really fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone's invited to register this week for classes at Matan. The semester opened this past week, and we have 70 weekly classes going on. I'm sure everyone can find something they're interested in.
Could we have the Daf Mekorot, please?
Yes. How can I distribute the makarot?
You can send them to Matan, and anybody who wants will anyone can request them from the office. We'll send them out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting.
Sharon,
Yes.
Did your nephew, how's he doing?
Oh, these trials are not up and running. He's curious. He hasn't signed up yet.
Oh, he hasn't signed up.
No.
Okay.
His father might have something to say about it.
Yeah, he
Okay,
may
is
have to
his
clear it with
father-
me first.
Pardon?
He'll have to clear it with me first, but I'll tell him that his aunt has given some good guidance.
Okay, you can record the share and let him see it. Also, it's a wonderful idea that he thinks halachically, that he wanted to clarify that before.